All right, so we're back. Another Science with Sergio. Last time we discussed a preprint that was on the predictive coding model of fatigue and some ideas surrounding complicated brain dynamics, right? Theories of consciousness, all that kind of stuff that potentially does have some practical application in understanding how and why athletes get tired when they're doing exercise that's challenging for them. And so we figured we would actually take a step back from the more exercise phys applications of predictive coding models, et cetera, and then jump into a more brain-based paper that is from Karl Friston, who's one of the more well-known proponents of some of these free energy principle theories of cognition, which can kind of tie together some ideas from Bayesian reasoning, predictive coding, all this stuff. And so we picked the free energy principle, a unified brain theory, which is one of Friston's review papers where he attempts to kind of lay out the broad strokes of his theory of the free energy principle for cognition and understanding how and why brains do what they do, and integrate that with a bunch of other theories about cognition, right? And try to make them all kind of make sense under one umbrella, which is this free energy principle, which is it's challenging, right? This is dense stuff. This is difficult. Reading through this paper, there was a decent amount of background required that I don't think I had to fully understand all the implications of what he was talking about and to fully understand all the different theories he's trying to kind of tie together here. But that said, I do think that if we do have an understanding of these free energy principle, whatever the implications of the free energy principle, that we can better understand the role of prediction in performance, the role of prediction in creating training for people, the role of prediction in communicating with athletes, and really just helping make a lot of stuff come together that sort of doesn't make sense on the surface. So, Sergio, do you want to try to explain what the heck Friston is talking about when he is talking about free energy?
Yeah, so free energy is it's this kind of like all-encompassing theory on how humans sort of become efficient at self-regulating and maintaining a more effective state of homeostasis, right? And homeostasis can be defined in like a biological system as just kind of like their constant internal environment relative to their external environment. And I think so what Friston is getting at with the free energy principle is that the biological system or the individual is constantly going to be measuring internal predictions of what it's experiencing relative to what it's actually experiencing. And the better an individual is at maintaining homeostasis, the less surprise or error there is between their prediction of what they're experiencing and what they're actually experiencing. And their physiology sort of becomes self-organized and developed as a result of being in situations where there's less of that prediction error. And that in turn is going to develop or influence how that sort of system of the individual develops and adapts.
Yeah, totally. And in this context, he's using free energy in the information theory definition, which I'm honestly not super knowledgeable about information theory, other than reading some Wikipedia articles and some random blog posts and papers that I'm not qualified to fully understand. And I do have more comfort with free energy in the sort of like chemistry sense of it, but I think that the concept here is somewhat similar. In this case, free energy is, I think, defined as the difference in essentially the prediction error, right? The free energy is the difference in the predicted state and the actual state that the organism ends up in. Is that correct? Is that what you took away?
Yeah, and the whole sort of goal of the organism is to set itself up so it's able to actually mitigate the amount of free energy in its internal environment relative to its external environment.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have an example of like a prediction error that might make this somewhat salient for people? Like as we talk about, okay, here's your internal state and here's your external state, and then there's some sort of delta between those. Like that's something that I think makes sense if you have something to attached to, but might be a little bit difficult to understand if we're just talking about it in theoretical and jargony terms.
Sure. So, so we can look at this in terms of exercise, and we can use a specific example. Let's do something like running, right? So the internal state of an individual at rest, there's going to be their heart rate is at a certain level, like blood oxygen saturation is at a certain level. And when they start to increase when they start to run, for example, the external environment is going to demand or facilitate an increase in potentially heart rate so that their physiology is able to sustain the change in their external environment, right? And so that could potentially look like increasing blood flow to the lower extremities, increasing blood flow or vasodilation so that you're able to get more blood to the lower body. And so you could say, for example, if you're not well versed in that change in your external environment, your prediction for what you're about to experience when you start running is going to be poor. So the amount of error you're making your prediction is going to be high. So the amount of free energy that individual has is high, which means their adaptability based on their prediction relative to what's actually happening in the body is poor. Does that kind of make sense? And the more they start to expose themselves to that physical scenario, the better they're able to make predictions relative to what or how their physiology has to self-organize itself to in turn return back to homeostasis sooner. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of related to what we were talking about last time when we were discussing the more applied consequences of some of these predictive coding models for fatigue, right? Where you're putting yourself in this situation where you have to make these subconscious predictions about how to regulate your body when doing something challenging. I was trying to think of an example that might even just be simpler to understand the idea of prediction and then prediction error. And so as you were talking, you mentioned running, and I was thinking about, okay, well, there's even simpler examples of someone making a prediction error and what that might be. So if you think about walking through your living room, right, you have this internal prediction of what's going to happen with your next footfall. So you're like, okay, I am predicting that my foot is going to land roughly in this spot and my weight distribution is going to roughly end up like this, so that these muscles should be preparing to stabilize my weight shift roughly this amount. And all these little internal calculations are happening on a subconscious level. And there's a lot of prediction error if you mispredict where exactly the leg of your couch is and you slam your toes into it. Right, that's a situation where there's a significant amount of prediction error occurring when you stub the shit out of your toe because you didn't properly predict the state of your foot in the future, and you didn't set up your gait cycle to properly move around that leg of the couch, and you ended up with a significant amount of free energy between the actual state that your foot ended up in and the predicted state of a normal step, right? And this is also a case where that was pretty negatively valenced, where now you're in pain. You're clutching your toes, you're hopping around, etc. But that might be an example of a prediction error and what we're actually talking about with this free energy state, right? Like predicted outcome is normal step, everything is great. Actual outcome is toe slams into wood, pain is shot through the nervous system, and the system is set up to try to learn from that and to try to avoid that kind of situation in the future where a prediction error is made, where there's a significant delta between the anticipated state and the actual state that you end up in. Does that seem right?
Yeah. So in that situation, because there's a large amount of prediction error, can that be seen as a large amount of stress placed on the individual because the difference between what they were expecting to experience and what they actually experienced was so high?
Yeah, I think so, right? And that's something that I am kind of interested and I don't know if this paper has a solid discussion of that per se, but in this case we have both a large difference between what we expect to happen and what actually happens, and then also the thing that actually happened was painful and bad. Right. I am curious what happens when there's a large difference and the outcome is positive. What is the learning that happens from that, right? Where it's like, okay, on a very zoomed in level, there's significant amount of prediction error, so high free energy. And on a zoomed out level, it's actually like a positive outcome where it's like, oh, you were taking a step and you expected it to be normal. And then when you landed, you like stepped on a trap door that you fell through into like a party where they give you $1 million. Like, yay, right? You have a lot of free energy in your prediction of what was going to happen, but the outcome is good for you. And, I don't actually feel like I have a good understanding of what the model would say about that type of situation, other than, okay, there's this free energy, there's this delta in what you predicted and what you expected. We need to adjust the priors in this case to account for the possibility that there might be trapdoors to surprise parties in your house, and like that needs to be at least part of the potential model to model future steps. I guess I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that's important to think about, because in the last paper we reviewed, they discussed predictive processing in relation to allostatic load, and how by having a solid base of prediction for what you're going to experience, you're able to somewhat manage or reduce the total allostatic load, which is like just the amount of physiological response to, I guess you could call it a stress or a stimuli, like the global physiological response to a stress or stimuli, and that like having a solid base of prediction that's a little bit more accurate in turn reduces the allostatic load or the total global stress placed on that like individual.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like so you walk out in the living room, stub the shit out of your toe. I feel like for you to not make that error again, you almost have to make that error in the first place. So you update your theoretical model for what you have to do so that you're not going to experience that again, and you're reducing the total stress placed on your body in that situation. But I feel like that almost has to happen in order for you to increase your capacity for seeing that as a potential error, in turn reducing the potential situation of stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think that's relevant to what you were talking about with training, where a lot of training is exposing someone to scenarios in which they will make prediction errors so that they can better update their priors about what should be happening as they exercise at high intensity. Right, that you need the exposure to errors at a certain level in order to update the model. And the goal is to make the exposure to those errors optimal to create updates and to get more training in, as opposed to being high enough errors in prediction that you just like get too tired to continue exercising or you get hurt.
Yeah, and I think in the context of like stubbing your toe is if you have, and I'll relate this back to training, but if you have, say you have poor levels of bone density, right, or just like low muscle tone in the toe, in your pinky toe, for example, right, like that in turn is going to result in you, that situation, potentially breaking your toe, which is going to be more of a stress than an individual that has like a really buff pinky toe, and more bone density in the feet. It might be a runner or something, I don't know, like barefoot runner. So their response to that error and prediction might be a little bit less, because their base of physiology sets them out to adapt to that situation a little bit better. And I think in training, you can think about that as like, if you have a solid base of physiology in whatever context of your performance you're trying to improve, when you go in and do specific types of stress on your system, your ability to learn to self-regulate is going to be better. And I guess I can put that into context of a specific example where it's like, if you have if you have a really strong aerobic system and then you start to do a lot of high intensity exercise, right? Your ability to respond and adapt and recover to that high intensity exercise is going to be more efficient, because your ability to kind of recover in your system that allows your body to take its error and prediction, update that model, and make you more prepared to handle that high intensity load is more efficient. So those things can kind of work in unison. And I think that can kind of be tied back to, it's important to build a base before like significantly overreaching and like having, strong bone density in that toe versus having like weak bone density in that toe.
Yeah, totally. I think that's an interesting point to think about. Let's call it the robustness of the system impacts the adaptability of the system, right? Where if you have the ability to tolerate a certain amount of error without falling apart, then that gives you more opportunity to continue doing reps, let's call it, so that you can learn more quickly and more in the future. And we see this in CrossFit athletes all the time, endurance athletes, et cetera, where some people seem to have a predisposition to handling more volume and being able to recover better than others, which then enables them to train more and get more repetitions in so that they learn better and learn not even necessarily more quickly in terms of like amount of learning per workout or per rep that they do, but because they can simply do so much more stuff before they start to fall apart, that the learning curve for them is altered relative to someone who has to be more cautious about how much training they do, right? So it's this sort of virtuous cycle for them where they're more robust in the first place, which enables them to train more, which enables them to get more reps in, which enables them to learn more. And because they're actually doing all this training, and they're able to recover so quickly, they're simultaneously increasing the robustness. And so that it just creates a positive feedback loop for them where they're just like doing more, learning more, getting more and more robust. And that's the type of thing that you see from athletes who have these rapid ascents from where they are to where they want to be. You're just like, oh wow, that's really going well for you. Congratulations.
Yeah, and I think for those people, I mean, I don't know, they pull up to the sport and they get pretty lucky in how their training develops because they have that like kind of base to build on, or for whatever reason they're just like a little bit more tolerable to that kind of volume, and like they're able to practice a little bit more. For somebody who might not, I mean, for most people who probably don't necessarily respond to that, do you think thinking about ways to develop your body's ability to manage free energy in the context of what you're experiencing when you exercise relative to what your body thinks you're supposed to be experiencing, how this could potentially, how the free energy principle could potentially give us a framework to think about how to improve our body's ability to create more positive relationships in our training with what we think should be happening and what's actually happening.
Yeah, totally. And let's stick with gait examples, right? We can stick with gait examples since I think that we've started there and this might actually work for what you're talking about, right? So let's say we imagine someone who wants to become better at trail running, right? And one of the key aspects of trail running is having a very solid intuitive sense of how and where to place your feet, right? So that you can kind of make it up slippery slopes and you can handle, jagged rocks on the path, et cetera, quickly, right? So that you can actually run fast and then also without getting injured. And then if we think about the free energy principle relative to foot placement on uncertain terrain, that there's this idea of a prediction of where exactly your foot should land and what's going to happen, right? And anyone who's gone hiking or potentially run up a sand dune or jogged on a trail somewhere, has this intuitive sense that you have to be somewhat careful. But again, you're not consciously thinking about like, all right, I need to dorsiflex exactly this much and make sure that I have exactly this much weight distribution on my left foot versus my right foot. And I need to fire TFL at exactly this time to, stabilize my hip as I push off. Like you're not thinking about that, but that stuff is all happening based upon, again, these predictions that your subconscious motor system is making about how each step is going to go, right? And you're talking about this idea of thinking about free energy here relative to training. And in this case, if we think about improving the skill of running on uncertain terrain, the way we would want to do that is to put ourselves in a situation where there is prediction error occurring, but not so much that it causes problems, right? Where if you're like, okay, I want to get better at trail running, I need to get faster at running on this specific type of trail at this incline with this amount of rocks, like going for a walk on freshly paved sidewalks is not going to help with that. Right? There's no prediction error in that scenario. Simultaneously, if we think about, going too fast in terrain that's too unstable, and then you slip and skid down the hill and end up, all scraped up and torn up, or if you have a misstep and sprain your ankle, like that's also prediction error, but that's not helpful because that ends your training session for the day and you're potentially hurt for the next 6 weeks or whatever, where you cannot do more repetitions, right? So what you want to do is put yourself in a situation with the optimal amount of prediction error that will cause improved updating of your model of how you should place your foot on each step so that you can learn appropriately. And in the future, that prediction error will be less, right? And as someone improves, then they can potentially go into more challenging scenarios. And then that more challenging scenario will be the appropriate amount of prediction error for them. And we can think about that. I mean, we're sticking with these kind of like outdoorsy sports, right? Like skiing, where when you're new to something like that, is it a green circle? Is that the right?
I have no idea.
I don't know. I think so. I think it's a green. Yeah, green circle is easy, right? And that scenario for someone who's new is going to create the optimum amount of prediction error for them in terms of how they should turn and how much they need to lean into their right foot versus their left foot, et cetera. And if that person tried to go, like you said, on a black diamond level slope, that they would just immediately fall and maybe hurt themselves and then have to go home, right? Like that's unhelpful. But after you've done a certain amount of repetitions on a green circle, then it's time to go to a blue square, and then it's time to go to a black diamond. And that any sort of training environment is going to be a matter of finding the right amount of prediction error that stimulates updating of your priors at an appropriate level that then lets you progress to something more challenging. And we can think about that on the conscious level, on the subconscious level, and then sort of like you were talking about on the physiological level relative to building bone density or, muscle mass or pliability of cardiovascular tissue, et cetera. I don't know. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. And I mean, so something I've been reading a lot about is, a little bit we talked about this a little bit before we started the podcast, but take, for example, something like EPO, right? Like erythropoietin. And that's something that people take specifically in endurance athletes might take extravenously to kind of induce a more effective system of oxygen delivery in the body. And so if you were to just go and start taking large amounts of EPO, your body, you would most likely die. You'd have something like myocardial infarction. Like your body's ability to tolerate that much O2 in the periphery would be so poor that you would just literally implode, right? So wouldn't your blood just turn to sludge? Yeah. Isn't that what happens? Yeah. Like your partial pressure of oxygen would be so high that your body would just kind of just like it like I said, your heart wouldn't really know what to do. So it would basically stop functioning. But so in that situation, like you basically don't have the physiology to manage an error in prediction and then in turn improve from something like that. Right. So like, because your tolerance for that stimulus is so low, and then your tolerance, not even tolerance for the stimulus, but because you have no tolerance for that stimulus, your tolerance to adapt and improve from that stimulus is so low, you basically die. And I think that's what happens in training. And that's what we see in something like overreaching, right? Like if you can't say your pulling mechanics are much stronger than your overhead and squatting mechanics, for example, in a snatch, right? And you can get under a 200-pound snatch like 200 times. You just don't have the structural stability in the shoulders to stand up from something like that, right? So in that situation, it's really easy to potentially overreach in attempting heavy snatches constantly. where it's like, okay, you want to learn how to make a snatch that's slightly more stressful on the system feel more similar to a stress that's a little bit less stressful on the system. So like a moderately heavy snatch, you want that to become more similar to a lighter snatch, right? And you do that by training at an intensity that allows you to create a more effective relationship between the increase in stimulus and the lower level of that stimulus, right? So you do snatches at 140 until they become a little bit more similar to the snatches at 135, et cetera, right? And you just continue doing that until you start to move your body's ability to better manage the error in prediction, so that when you go and you catch a heavy snatch, right, like your body's able to handle what is a new stress effectively because your physiology had the time to create a base, so it's able to self-organize and actually improve from that. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think that the paper itself actually uses the analogy of being in a dark room and trying to sort of feel your way around, right? That the stuff that you do is based upon the map that you have in your head of what's going to happen. So if you think of in the example you just used, snatching, right? It's like you want this map of what snatching feels like and what should be happening to be pretty well developed. The same way that if you're in a room that you feel pretty comfortable in and the power goes out and you're trying to find your way out, you're like, okay, well, the couch should be here and the doorway should be over there. So based upon your predictions, you are feeling with your senses for things that should be there, essentially, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to reach out for the couch now because I'm pretty sure it's somewhere around here. Oh, I don't feel it. And then you kind of take a little step and then you feel it. It's like, okay, you're the sensory information that you're collecting is at least partially defined by what your predictions are for what that movement should feel like. And in this case, the layout of your room. So by snatching repeatedly, you're improving your map of what that movement should feel like and what type of sensory information you should be looking for and you should be collecting to make that movement successful. And so as you get better at snatching, like you said, at these lower weights, that map becomes better, which then facilitates you potentially pushing the weight a little bit more because there's less variation in what each of those reps is going to potentially look like and feel like. Even if, on a very micro level, all of those reps is slightly different.
Yeah, and I think the thing, and sticking with the snatch example, is that like with any experience, you can't make, like you don't know what that experience is going to feel like until you actually experience that experience, right? So until you snatch 140, 135 will always be a 135 snatch. And a 135 snatch won't teach you how to snatch 140, right? And I mean, take that with a grain of salt, because what I mean is like, you still don't, it's a different weight. Like you don't exactly know what that feels like, but your capacity to move 135 improves for whatever reason, your physiology has improved and your stress response to that is now lower. When you go and snatch 140, your capacity to then improve at the next level of intensity is better because it's more closely related to, the 135. And so your error in between what you're expecting to experience and what you're actually experiencing is going to be a little bit less, which means your self-regulating capacity and then your ability to grow from that is going to be much more effective than if you're just going 135 to 185 or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and what you're getting at there, I think, touches on two failure modes that we see in coaching. I mean, we can use the weightlifting example to kind of discuss that, right? And one side is the idea of like, okay, you can never do anything until you're able to snatch a broomstick with absolutely perfect technique, right? This kind of like very rigid, structured idea of no progression can be made until everything is absolutely perfect, which, as you said, the development of a skill in a specific context is helpful for the next stage, but isn't necessarily perfect. That things change as you add load, in this case, to a snatch. And the assumption that the best way and the only way to improve is to perfect the situation at a lower weight is just not right. The transfer there isn't going to happen, and you do need to expose yourself two scenarios where you can have a certain amount of prediction error in order to learn what to do at that heavier weight, right? Where it's like, oh, I've been working on this broomstick and minimized my prediction error with broomstick weight. And now I try to do empty barbell weight, which is going to be 44 pounds heavier or whatever. And all of a sudden my prediction error is huge. And then, this school of thought would say, okay, we'll keep doing that until that prediction error is small enough that you can feel comfortable moving on to the next one. But I think that if you look at this from this kind of like predictive coding model, what you want to see, instead of making the prediction error as small as possible at each step before moving to the next one, is utilizing the previous step to reduce the prediction error such that when you do move to that next step, that the prediction error is manageable. Right? That the point at which that prediction error becomes manageable is when it's potentially appropriate to focus more on that heavier lift, not necessarily when the prediction error is zero at the lighter lift. Right? So that I think kind of makes sense of like why people can get stuck on like, okay, you have to do everything exactly right before you move on. But it's just not necessarily the right way of thinking about it.
No, and I think thinking about our sport, it's like it's or like the sport of CrossFit, it's you need to have such a robust system of adaptation, because there's not going to be a lot of experiences, and meaning that you're not going to do a lot of things that are very similar to something that you might have done before. In that, like, you might have a different rep scheme every time you walk into a gym and do a workout. Now, the things you're experiencing in your body might be similar, and there's similarities in what your body's doing to facilitate like a specific output of energy to sustain that amount of work. And you might do different 10-minute AMRAPs, right? But your body's ability to understand the similarities with those differences, I think, is what develops like a really good CrossFit athlete. Because in the short term, like, that's what allows them to adapt in familiar situations, quote unquote familiar situations. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that kind of gets at what I was going to say about the other failure mode for weightlifting too, right? So we're getting messy with our different analogies and situations here. So I'll stick with the weightlifting one, and then we can try to tie it back into the conditioning stuff that you were just talking about, right? So the one failure mode that I was just talking about is this idea of making sure everything is absolutely perfect at a specific weight or movement or level before attempting to move to the next one. And then the other side of that is something looking like a Bulgarian system, which is like go heavy all day, every time, always. And, that does work for some people as well. Some people obviously win gold medals and are extremely successful with that. And in that situation, right, what you're seeing is that by practicing this skill of going heavy, that's beneficial for the sport of weightlifting, where you want to go heavy to win, right? But for some people, the prediction error in their movement is going to be too high for them to be able to get effective training out of doing that repeatedly, right? And we can think of that in terms of the actual exact biomechanics of doing the stuff. We can think about that in terms of the physiology of being able to adapt to the training load. But if that delta is consistently too high, people are going to be in a position where they're not learning effectively, and they're not able to update their movement quality or respond on a more like physical level in terms of altered hormone patterns or muscle protein synthesis or whatever the outcome that we want is, and that we actually start to see problems there. And so to what you were saying about CrossFit athletes handling these different scenarios, right? I think that what we see is that people who are good and who are talented is that even in situations that are far outside of their comfort zone, they are better able to predict what's going to happen in the first place. And they probably also have a wider buffer of prediction error that they can tolerate, right? So they probably have an advantage in both of those scenarios, where it's like you're going to have less prediction error just based upon the fact that you have more training or have more experience or have some sort of like intuitive talent for handling this type of stuff, as well as the physiology to back it up. And even if you do have errors, they impact you less in a negative way because you have a broader tolerance of error that you can tolerate and adapt to. And again, I think that's when you see people who just get really, really good, really, really fast, especially doing training programs that are just kind of like crazy and all over the place, right? That seem outrageous and would probably mess up most of the people doing it. It's like, well, this person makes fewer mistakes, and when they make mistakes, they can tolerate more of a mistake, whatever absolute value. And so it's just fine for them.
Would you consider athleticism a measure of being able to mitigate or being better at mitigating free energy and or your exposure to free energy in novel situations? So, and I can give you an example of that, but like say somebody who's like comes from, you have this kid that's played like 10 different sports growing up, and they're 16 years old. And so in every one of those different sports, they put themselves through different patterns of movement. They're training different energy systems, right? Like they have a requisite degree of muscle mass and like their physiology is set up in a way that when they're coming in the context of the snatch, they go and they learn the snatch, right? Like the first time they pick up a barbell, it looks kind of sketchy, but they do it 10 times and it looks like they're learning really, really quickly. And it's because, using like the free energy principle, I'm going to assume it's because they're able to pull from their past experiences and create more effective associations with the physical stimulus from all the sports that they've played in their past life experiences, and then apply that to what they're experiencing right then when they snatch.
Yeah, totally.
And I think like that degree of athleticism in turn reduces the total entropy that system is exposed to, which, and then like it's just a measure of the amount of stress that they're experiencing, which is, like they're able to train a little bit more because they're not as stressed as maybe somebody else who can't adapt like that or can't create those connections because they don't have those experiences. So, I mean, I don't know. I think you can potentially look at athleticism in the context of free energy as just having like the neural ability to predict and relate that to your physiology and then apply that physiology to the actual experience more effectively.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it depends on a little bit on what you mean by athleticism, since I think that people can mean different things with that. If you just sort of mean like a global talent for skill acquisition in a sporting environment, like I totally agree with that, right? I do think sometimes people, when they discuss athleticism, just mean speed and explosive ability and strength or whatever. Right? I mean, you hear that in a basketball context where it's like, oh, he's super athletic, meaning, that they can sort of like run the court and jump out of the gym. But sometimes those athletic players really struggle with skill acquisition and aren't able to continue to play at a high level, where it's like, yeah, super athletic, crazy shot blocker or whatever, but just like can't learn to hit a jump shot and figure out where to go on defense. Right. And so like, that's a slightly different definition of athleticism, I guess. But
yeah, so in this context, I mean athleticism in the sense that like maybe somebody who's athletic might not be the most naturally gifted sprinter, but they figure out very quickly how to organize their gait to become as effective as possible in a sprint relative to what their physiology can actually do.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
For sure. And well, to that point as well, I think that you see that anyone who's coached athletes who are at a high level, whether that's in a sport like CrossFit or potentially someone coming into like a CrossFit or CrossFit adjacent gym who is a high level athlete in another sport, right? I've seen this multiple times where you have someone come in who's, an NFL player or a Major League Baseball player or someone who, has a history of competing at the Olympics or something. And you're like, oh man, this person's going to be a freak. And then it turns out that they're actually extremely bad at a lot of stuff. And you're like, what is actually going on here? And what they can do is not necessarily everything perfectly all the time, but given the constraints that they have, they're able to adapt very quickly to whatever the requirements of their sport are and develop a strategy that's effective for them. Right. And it might not be correct per se, but there's clearly something that they're able to do that other folks don't have the capacity to do.
And I think that's so because there's so many skills in this sport that you have to be good at. I think it's important to see like that and that idea of athleticism and that ability to in turn reduce the total stress placed on the system relative to new experiences. I think is not like, you might look at an Olympic weightlifter and especially at the highest level, a lot of Olympic weightlifters are built a certain way. Right. And, they might have like shorter limbs, longer torsos. In general, they just might be a little bit shorter, a little bit stockier. And then you have, for example, like a CrossFit athlete that's a little bit taller. and they're not exact. They might say, even if they've done Olympic weightlifting for years and years, they might not even be at the highest level because their physiology has limited them. For whatever reason, in this case, it could just have like a higher ape index. They could just have like really annoyingly long arms or something like that makes it harder for them to snatch. But what they've done is they've figured out how to self-organize their body to do the best that they could potentially do relative to what they have. And so it's like that might look different in the context of what a clean looks like as far as efficiency goes in a CrossFit scenario. So it's like their cleans or their touch and go power cleans to be effective at getting them to be really good at doing like touch and go power cleans, for example, in a conditioning setting. It might not look what it looks like for somebody else, but because they have that ability to kind of create an association between what's the most efficient thing for their body to do, that allows them to become better at self-regulating while they're doing that, and being able to understand how that looks different for different individuals, I think is important as well. And you kind of like in one programming, you give people the opportunity to sort of figure that out themselves with a little addition of what you potentially might think is helpful. But you're doing that simply by putting them in situations where they're exposed to needing to figure that out very, very gradually without overreaching to a point where they're regressing from something like that.
So if you have someone who is, athletic in your definition here, and meaning that they are good at self-organizing and figuring things out in a way that seems to function for their body and their background, and they end up doing something in a way that as a coach looks non-optimal, right? Whether that's technique on a lift or that's pacing strategy on a workout or whatever, how much do you then intervene and say, hey, listen, we need to fix your snatch technique, or we need to fix your deadlift technique, or we need to discuss your tracing or your pacing strategy? And how much do you let them work through it on their own and kind of trust what they come up with, let's say?
Well, I think that's hard to say, right? Like, I think it depends on what you're trying to work on. Like, I think in say in a strength setting, with overreaching, there's a little bit more potential for injury, right? And overreaching with improper form, like you just pre-expose yourself to getting hurt a little bit higher than if you in a conditioning setting, like say you, for example, are doing a workout where you're pushing anaerobic threshold and you like bonk too soon, right? And like you're supposed to be hitting like 4-minute intervals and you cash out at like 3 minutes, right? Like at that point, it's really easy to have a discussion where it's like, hey, you just probably went a little harder than you needed to. Let's back off and go a little bit. Like let's just move at a lighter pace. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But in the context of strength and movement patterns under load, I think that becomes a little bit more difficult. Then it becomes like, okay, look at the individual, assess their levers. Is this, and then from there, I think it just becomes like, is this something that's safe? And then with picking the right gradual amount of exposure, you just want to put them in situations where you're kind of riding that threshold of like, okay, this isn't going to hurt them. And this is going to continue to kind of like help me see where they're starting to fall apart and then isolate where they're falling apart, whether it's most likely a physical quality or just kind of like an emotional response, assess that, and then go from there. So like kind of like writing that line where you're able to start to visualize where things go wrong, whether that's biomechanically or physiologically, and then letting them work at that threshold as much as possible safely is kind of like the best way to approach that. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that we could even use an example on a more zoomed in level, right, of someone who let's say squats with an asymmetric stance, right? That they tend to have their right foot a little bit back and a little bit more turned out. And you can see a little bit of hip shift as they stand, right? And as a coach, you may notice that and you're like, oh, God, I've got an asymmetric stance here. This is something we need to solve. And then the question becomes, okay, is this a strategy that they've subconsciously developed that works around bony alterations that they have in their hip joint and is actually pretty good for them? Or is this something that they're compensating for a poor movement pattern elsewhere, and we can actually benefit them by trying to, improve their understanding of where their feet are and potentially develop let's say, better hip mobility and hip flexion on the right side. And I don't think there's a clear answer to that. There's not a right or a wrong way to approach that. It's more a matter of understanding that in some cases, these strategies that people have developed are this kind of effective bottoms up way of minimizing prediction error in their movements that actually make them better and are good strategies for them to get through something. And in other cases, it's, again, a strategy that they've developed to minimize free energy in a way that is counterproductive and is going to impact them longer term. And I think that part of the art, quote unquote, of coaching is having an intuition for which type of thing is worth focusing on and which type of thing is not worth focusing on. And I don't know that there's a great way to really frame out a decision tree for that.
Well, I think you can think of that in the context of like low hanging fruit and like what's like, I mean, if you improve something, say somebody stands with or squats with an asymmetrical stance, and I mean, okay, I can use myself as an example. Like I, for example, tend to experience an impingement in my right hip, right? And so I am able to mitigate that sensation by putting my right foot out a little bit more and having my right foot back relative to where my left foot is. Okay. And so I can improve my squat with this stance relative to these positions by doing that. But at what point is that limiting me in other areas of my performance, right? And it's like that. So in that situation, there's a couple ways to, and I don't think we've touched on this yet, but there's a couple ways to mitigate free energy and the amount of entropy that the systems experience. And you
we didn't even talk about entropy. We should pull back to the actual paper and hit some of that stuff.
And so you can, and it's so there's perception and there's action, right? So you can change your internal environment or your kind of like prediction for what you're experiencing. You can update that theoretical model, or you can update your external environment and like change your surroundings to better match your internal predictions, right? And do you have a kind of a good example of what that might look like?
Yeah, I mean, the one used, which I think we actually talked about a little bit last time we discussed this, as you take a drink, right, is that you can imagine the idea of having a prediction of your arm being in a certain spot in space, holding a bottle to your lips, as you just did, right? And the prediction of that happening, you can minimize the free energy between that prediction and real life by grabbing a bottle of Topo Chico and lifting it and holding it to your lips, right? And that's an example of actually moving and changing your external state to match the internal predicted state, right? So that's an example of one of the ways, right? And then the other way is updating your internal model of what's actually happening, which would be, we've used some examples previously on this episode where you may have a prediction about how a certain movement is going to go or a thing that you're going to do. And then when you encounter reality and it doesn't match that, then that model potentially needs to be updated for the future to better not stub your toe on the couch or whatever.
Could you look at that in sort of a sense of how you experience and deal with pain or adapt to pain, right? Like, do you, so say in a workout, you're in a lot of discomfort. And I think in an acute setting, when you do like a really hard 5-minute AMRAP, I don't know, just say like touch and go power snatches and like a salt bike. In that situation, you're experiencing a lot of discomfort, and there's probably going to be a large amount of error in prediction of what you're actually experiencing what you were expecting to experience. Most likely because you've never experienced that before. So in that situation, you can reduce the total error in that prediction and make what you were expecting to experience more like what you're actually experiencing, or feel like what you're actually experiencing by reducing how fast you're going in that workout, just by slowing down a little bit. And then so the more you gradually start to expose yourself to that specific scenario, whether it's the same workout or scenarios that are similar, and so you can start to create associations, I think you can start to sort of respond more effectively by updating. And I think both of these things are happening like concurrently, right? So you might still continue to slow down a little bit, like physically with your output, but in turn, your body's internal self-regulation and sort of like ability to deal with pain slightly starts to improve. So they're both starting to kind of meet in the middle until you kind of find that like point of optimization that you're like, okay, like this is kind of what it's supposed to feel like. I'm better at facilitating, I don't know, more blood flow to this specific part of my body because that's reducing this kind of experience of like this hypoxic state, which might be associated with more pain, right? So in doing that, I'm sort of updating what I'm actually feeling, and that's becoming a little bit more like what I'm expecting to feel. But also at the same time, I'm reducing my output, so those two things are able to work at like simultaneously to reduce the total amount of entropy here, right?
Yeah. Well, I think the way that you framed it as meeting in the middle is very appropriate and accurate, right? And we talked about some of this stuff last time discussing like rate of perceived exertion and fatigue. And to use your example of, what was it, power snatches and assault bike? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if we use an example of a power snatch and assault bike workout, we have an internal prediction of what that is going to potentially feel like. And if the delta is too high there, then I think that essentially spikes RPE, right? Like your rate of perceived exertion goes way, way, way up if your prediction is way off in terms of how things are going to feel, right? Because how much actual exercise discomfort someone is in is not always closely related to their actual performance. Because you can have workouts where you feel awful, but you're able to kind of like ride it and keep going, right? And you have other times where you feel awful and you essentially just fall apart and sometimes quit on the workout. And some of that is going to be related. We used Marcora's rate of perceived exertion and motivation model of fatigue, right? In some cases, if your motivation is high, you can continue to push longer if your rate of perceived exertion is also high. But in other cases, I don't think it's just motivation that is the factor that dictates whether or not someone is able to continue to push. I think it's the delta that you were sort of touching on, right? This free energy between the predicted state that your body is going to be in and the state that it's actually in. So as you were saying, by training, your prediction for what that is going to feel like becomes more accurate. So there's less free energy in that predictive model, which then means that even if it hurts just as much, even if it's just as painful in terms of like the actual exercise discomfort itself, there's not as much prediction error, which doesn't cause the same desire or tendency to slow down to get out of prediction error, right? It's like you expected this and it is exactly what you felt like, which is bad, but that's okay because you knew it was going to be bad. But if you don't know it's going to be bad, then that's a very challenging situation. And sort of like you were saying, there's all these other forces that are kind of meeting in the middle too, which is, your conscious pacing of your effort, your actual physical system's ability to pump your heart, deliver oxygen, continue to contract muscle fibers, have calluses on your hands to be able to handle the friction of the barbell, right? That all of these pieces are also potentially improving as you train. And that where all those pieces meet in the middle is going to be what your performance, what you're capable of from a performance level, I think.
Yeah, and that's so, and I think that ties back into like being very, I wouldn't necessarily say being very meticulous, just being aware of the type of progression that you're using, whether on yourself or with your athletes, because that's the thing that's going to enable them to experience enough stress to stimulate or force an adaptation response without surpassing your own physiological capacity to actually adapt and respond to that situation. And
For sure.
Right. And I think that's the balance, right? Because then you're able to effectively update your internal models for what you should be experiencing and better match that with your physiological output and what you're actually experiencing.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. I think that's a fantastic summary of some of the potential takeaways here, right? I mean, Friston isn't talking about any of this in the actual paper, right? Nice. The actual paper is a lot of mathematical notation that I wasn't necessarily able to follow about disparate models of cognition. But I think if we're trying to take something away, I think that kind of nails it.